Anyway, I've been running around like a headless chicken. I just got off a clubhouse with some bipolar people, and that was interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't my room. I just went in there to have a chat with people because I didn't have anything to do while I was walking my dog. And I said what I needed to say, which was, I'm feeling like, this, that, and the other. I feel like I'm pretty good with my emotional health usually. But for some reason, over the last couple of weeks, I've just started to like kind of go back and forth and back and forth. And I
Yeah.
said, if anyone's got any suggestions on the things that I can do, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't take drugs, I don't, drink coffee or anything. Um, and then I did that. And then they were like, yes, great. And then someone else came in and was like, can I just take this opportunity to just say something? And then they said their whole spiel, like their whole story. And then everyone started talking about that. And I was like, okay, I'm out of here.
Okay. Well, now is your chance. We can go deep dive into
Yeah,
whatever.
right.
You can
Yeah.
use this as
They
your
don't have you.
personal.
I have you. They have
Yes.
no idea what I'm getting up to now. So yeah, but I wanted to ask you actually, how did you get into this industry in the first place? Like, was this what you wanted to do when you were growing up? Like, or was there something that happened and you kind of shifted your focus?
Yeah, great question. It was not what I thought I would be doing to start out. When I went to undergraduate, I figured out eventually like that I wanted to go into therapy and counseling. And that took a little while to figure out because when you're a kid growing up, you get you get told if you're good at science or math, but not if you're good at relational dynamics and a good listener. And so when that clicked for me, that's what started my passion in going into the therapy field, was recognizing, oh, this is a perfect fit for what I'm interested in and what I'm naturally good at. However, when I went to grad school for marriage and family therapy, I always had the sense that it would be a foundation for something else, that there wasn't a precedent for what I would end up doing. So I just kind of went into it knowing that I wanted to get the skill and training, because you can be a helper, you can like care about people, but have no idea what do you do if someone has anxiety or suicidal or something like that. So I wanted to kind of marry the passion with the skills, but I had a sense that it would be a foundation for something else.
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people in the system as it is, when they go through university or at least high school, heading into college, university, don't know what they want to do. They haven't had enough life experience yet to figure
Right.
it out, which is really crazy when you think about it. Like, we've got all of these young people who are just being thrown into this professional career without actually ever having really figured out what they want to do most of the time. But
Right.
and so you started out kind of not working with high performers, as far as I remember you saying. What kind of work did
Yes.
you begin with?
Yeah, so my background, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my specialty was complex trauma and PTSD. So I was in that field for about 10 years before shifting to working with high performers, CEOs, and entrepreneurs. And so basically, I was in a private therapy practice and working with people coming out of relationships with narcissists, sociopaths, people coming out of spiritual abuse and manipulation, and then kind of anxiety, depression, and couples work, all kind of the range of things.
Spiritual abuse? What is that?
Yeah, good question. So that can be a range of things. So that could be anything from a really obvious cult where there's the intent to harm and manipulate someone, all the way to really well-meaning structures where people end up imposing their views in it, and someone has a hard time figuring out who they are, what is their faith apart to what was imposed on them by other people.
Hmm. I'm sure there's someone with a clinic near the Westboro Baptist Church who's just like really raking it in right now. You know, uh, but that's
There's a
really,
business idea.
it's a good business idea. I'm always kind of like thinking of these niche businesses. But yeah, that's fascinating. I do relate to what you're doing now, very much so. You
Yeah.
moved into the working with high performers, people who are at the top of their game, C-level, I guess, entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
directors. So how did you adjust to that? And well, why did you get into that? And how did you adjust? Because it's a very different landscape, right?
Yes, it is. It's a great question. So it was about 4 years ago that I closed my therapy practice and shifted into founding Scaling Within, which is the work that I do now. So a lot of high performers, CEOs, people's goal in the world is to scale what they do, whether it's scale their revenue or scale their impact. And I don't think you can scale well externally without continually expanding your internal capacity to sustain growth. So that's kind of really what it is. But the reason that I went into it was seeing whether it's the head of a family, a business, an organization, the issues at the top always flow down. So if you
Mm,
can have kind of healthy, wholehearted people at the top of systems, it automatically flows into healthier cultures, not only within an organization or a team, but also impacting whoever receives the product or service being offered. So I guess in a way, it was a way to scale my impact without even realizing it at the time. And the other piece of that was really having a passion for who I would name the pioneers, the waymakers, the people that are innovating and wanting to bring change in different areas of society. That when you're in a position to pour out to a lot of people, that those are the people that need a place to be poured into and to be able to work through and process through things. So that was really my interest in shifting over, was wanting to service those people. And you're right, it was a difference. How I saw it before, I loved the work that I did with complex trauma and PTSD, and it's a really important foundation to the work that I do. The difference to me is that work was putting a lot of input and seeing just a little bit of output. And now working with high performers, it's giving a little bit that's taken a really long way and flows down in its impact. However, the similarity is that typically high performers, entrepreneurs are experiencing a lot of trauma all the time, and they have a high tolerance for pain and don't always have the awareness to recognize what are the healthy levels there. So that's, I think, where a big tie-in comes in.
mm. I'm going to get to that because I've got a really good
Yeah.
question for you. I think it's a good question anyway. But on the topic of, like impact, which is what you were mentioning,
Yeah.
it's kind of like the way I describe it to people who I talk to about these kinds of things. Um, I describe it like, do you want to be Mother Teresa or do you want to be Bill Gates in terms of impact? I mean, like nothing else. It's
Yeah.
just like, how do you want to impact the world? And for some people, they find being Mother Teresa. They're very caring and kind people, and they can't let someone, kind of pass them by who's suffering. And I'm kind of like that too. I do really kind of take on a lot of my mother's traits, and she's one of the most caring people you'll ever meet. But when you look at it from a business perspective, or not even a business perspective, but like the perspective of having an impact on the planet, we all want to be somewhat responsible for the human race. We all want to have leave our mark and help in some way, unless there's something seriously wrong with us. And I think when you have like a bunch of choices in front of you, options, and you can say this also about philanthropy too.
Yeah.
In the world of philanthropy, you've got a lot of options where to put your money. It's like the stock market. You can choose which investments to make.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think I was listening to, I think it was Sam Harris's podcast, Making Sense. And one episode, he had a PhD who basically studies philanthropy. And he said that even with like just choosing a different avenue to put your money into, whether it's $10 or $100 or more, you might think that, right, okay, it's fine to just give it to your local homeless shelter. Why not? That's a good thing to do. However, if you're going for maximum impact, if you invest the same amount of money into, let's say, nets that have been laced with anti-malaria drug, those nets, when they're used to kind of get the mosquitoes, can save hundreds of lives just with that money that you've kind of given. So it's really important to think about impact. So that's kind of a long way around coming back to it. So I kind of appreciate the fact that you were thinking about those things, because it is important how we use our resources and time.
Yeah, I love what you just brought up. And really, I think it's both, and like both sides are important. It's important to help the one, and at the same time, if you want to see long lasting systemic change, that always goes from the top. So I think that was really the heart behind the shift. Is okay, my foundation was working with the one person at a time, in order to be able to step back and how do we impact the world and systems in a way where it flows down. And this was probably not conscious, but I think growing up, my internal idea was that if you were a caring person or if you were a helper, you go into the helping professions, the medical field, or, therapy, social work, philanthropy, those types of things. And if you go into the business world, you care more about money. And really what I have come to find out was a lot of those systems are really stuck in a poverty mindset, and they don't always get, like, nonprofit. Again, that work is all very good, but a lot of time the structure doesn't actually allow maximum impact. And so really what my interest in was seeing, what does it look like for profit social enterprises, or people that have a vision to bring change in the world and can actually generate revenue in a way to see that change sustainably happen? To me, that's pretty fascinating to look at that model.
Right, I see. Yeah, and it's an interest, like, so it's not something that I think it's got a not got a long history, right? I mean, that's a relatively
Yep.
new niche, because we are at a point in time now where, almost like you would look at the Olympics, at the beginning, there were records being broken all the time. And when we started to reach let's say, the human physical potential, those records became a lot harder to break without serious investment in research and development, science, drugs and things like that. So I would think that we're looking at something similar, whereby the frontier was relatively unconquered at the beginning. We had the railroads and everything, and industry kind of started to boom. And now we've got such high competition, and there's such high stakes that people are literally, they're literally killing themselves working, right?
Yeah.
The pressure is that strong. I was in the Philippines. When I was in the Philippines, I was friends, and I still am friends, I suppose, but we don't talk that much anymore. But I was friends with someone who ran Google in the Philippines, the country head. And he understandably was under a hell of a lot of pressure to meet sales targets in general. And he would, I won't disclose too much, but basically he had his ways of dealing with it, just like I had my ways of dealing with stress as well. And they weren't entirely healthy. And I remember he told me once, he went to see the doctor, and the doctor said, "You've got to stop working. You've got to get out of this lifestyle, because you're going to die. You're going to die soon." His blood pressure was off the charts. His cholesterol was just off the charts. He was going to have a heart attack. So he did. He quit. And he said it was the best decision he ever made. And he started to just enjoy life more, and not stress too much. But I'm not saying it wasn't a great job, and he definitely appreciates it for what it was. It's just that, like I said, it was just to reinforce the point that I was making, that we're in these uncharted territories now, where everything is about maximum performance, maximum efficiency. And I think we struggle to integrate the human side of things, because now we've got artificial intelligence. how are we going to compete with that? Like we have to
Yeah.
try to some degree, but we're going to lose one day. So I feel like we're definitely in the spectrum. How do you find your clients in these situations? What kind of situations are we talking about here?
Yeah, I'm really struck by a few things you're saying. One, the uncharted territory. I think we're in a very much an uncharted time in history. I mean, it might sound a little extreme, but I think of it as a transition of eras, like a time where in the history books we'll look back and see the world was this way and it started to shift. We're seeing every industry being shaken on its head, or at least we're coming to a collective ceiling where the way that things have been are not the way that they're going forward. We're having all these different shifts, and even just on social media, if we talk about mental health awareness, there's so much more language for things than ever before. That's producing a shift. You also have technology, social media bombarding us with continual inputs and demand where it's impossible to stay on top of everything. It's impossible to keep track of all your DMs and messages and pings and things coming from every angle. So there's so much increasing, expanding potential, and we're hitting new limits. And so what does that mean going forward? I think that brings up a lot of interesting points in terms of burnout, or what does it mean to do great things for the world, but not at the expense of yourself? Where is that line? How does this all play out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of. Maybe you're right. Maybe that we are about to go into a huge transition and look back at this as like the pinnacle of the human potential when it comes to our ability to handle this level of pressure. Because I feel like,
Yeah.
with the AI, maybe, and I don't mean to dive into these kinds of things. It's a relationships podcast and whatnot, but I do have a history with working in startups and I have a digital marketing agency. So I don't know if many people know this. So I do have a fair interest in the human potential when it comes to achievement and building businesses and things. And I can see how, yes, we're about to hit our max and like kind of hand the baton in the relay race over to something that is not alive, but will beat us at a multiple, right? Because artificial intelligence is just going to take over. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you have something to say, but I just want to like finish off
Yeah.
and say that I can see the revolution of industries shifting from a profit-oriented mindset to a human-oriented mindset, because we won't be lifting as much of the work anymore, and we will have to
Yeah.
deal with what it means to be a human and try to cater more to that. So I think I remember reading a study that human resources, specifically learning and development, was like the number one investment for the near future, because AI will take off all of the jobs
Yeah.
that we're doing that are technical. So yeah.
No, there's so much fascinating things, and a lot of that is way above my out of my area of expertise. But what I do think is interesting is I often think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and apply that to a lot of things. And if you're not familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, briefly, it's a pyramid that helps us understand human development. And at the bottom of the pyramid is our basic needs, our survival needs like food, water, shelter. Above that is safety. And then we all need to belong. We all need self-esteem. And at the very top is self-actualization. That's when you find like your higher purpose in life. And basically, you can't get to the higher levels if you don't have the lower levels met. So what's interesting is the more that the even just conceptually those basic functions in society and work life are taken over or automated, that brings the ability to step up higher. The other thing is every time we reach a ceiling, whether that's individually as a person in our own personal growth, or whether that's a company, whether that's a system in society, every time we identify a ceiling, it's an opportunity to become a new floor. So basically, just talking about in our own relationship with ourselves, we can all go so far based on our natural skills and abilities. And then you hit a ceiling where something in me is not cutting it to get to the next level. Whether that's I don't have skills in this area to grow my business, or I don't know how to navigate this conflict with my partner. I don't have these different skills. I don't have the self-awareness. Whatever it is, whenever you reach a ceiling, it's an opportunity to become your new floor. By that, I mean, whenever we push through what used to be a ceiling, it's then our new starting point. I almost picture the only video game I ever played growing up was Mario Brothers. So that's my only frame of reference here. But like basically when you're on a level, when you're on a level in Mario Brothers, you're like getting the coins, killing the bad guys, and then you get to the big bad guy at the end. And when you finally conquer him, you're in a whole new level with new things to explore. If you die there, you don't go straight back to the beginning of the game. You go to the beginning of that level. So part of even how I see scaling within, what that concept means, it's almost kind of like scaling a mountain of your own personal development or your potential. And you're continually hitting ceilings, identifying them and overcoming them and leveling up. So for example, as a society, if we reach a ceiling of what we're capable of competing with AI or max capacity, we over optimize and crash, well, then that's the potential for a new way of doing things. Whenever we have awareness, we have a new path forward of potential. And so that's where we get into new frontiers, which I think is kind of exciting.
Just a riff on a point that you made about not going back to square one when we die. All right, as a metaphor, obviously not as the absolute truth, but in my case, I feel like I devolved at a certain point in my life. Like I lived in a bubble. I created a bubble for myself because I was running away from my internal. I didn't know this until later, but I had actually created this bubble where nothing challenged me because I didn't want the challenge. I wanted to have comfort. And I spent probably 5 years or more in that bubble. And what happened was I atrophied internally. I actually got in the best shape of my life, but that was physical. The emotional, mental part of me atrophied. So it kind of just became loose and gooey and soft. So it was a really hard place to get out of. I felt like I'd taken 2 steps back. And it's funny because you look at it and you're like, you want to regret it. You know, you want to kind of say, what a waste of time. Like I could have had so much accomplished in those 5 or so years. But then there's another part of you that says, oh, that was my journey. Like I needed to go through that to be able to grow to the next level. And honestly, after that, everything was just like up, boom, straight up. But yeah, I mean, maybe that was me plateauing and not going back to, maybe in my mind, I was just going back, but in reality, I was just getting ready for the next level. So that's.
Yeah, no, I love that actually. I think of that as like a catapult moment where there's times or seasons in life where it feels like we're getting pulled backward and it's like the tension is increasing. And you might actually kind of be going back in some areas, but there's other things happening in different areas of your life. And the scene is being set that when it's time, you are able to catapult even farther forward than you would have otherwise. And so to me, this is one of the key mindsets, I think, for high performers or just humans in general, is having the mindset that it's not what happens to you, it's what you do with it. It sounds corny, but it's really true. It's basically that anything can either be a stumbling block or a stepping stone. The choice is always ours. Is this going to be a stumbling block in my life, or am I going to leverage this as a stepping stone to take me further?
Oh, I love that. The catapult moment. That's really, really nice. If anyone's listening to this who feels like they're going through something similar, it might be your catapult moment, right? That's a brilliant way to put it.
Can I Oh, can I just give an example, a more concrete example of that just came to mind? I'm just thinking of this. One of the CEOs that I work with, he has this really amazing company, and he's like a big mover and a shaker and always getting things done and making it happen. And when I started working with him, he started to enter into a new season where he was beginning to pull back and re-enter the visionary part of his role and give over some of the responsibilities to team members. And he was having a hard time, though. Some people call this letting go of the vine, or it's beginning to let other people care for your baby and not be involved so that it can scale and grow. But basically, it was a new time because he wasn't used to pulling back, and it felt different to not be in that intense mode. And so we talked a lot about that catapult season where this is not forever, but you actually have to have seasons where there's a ebb and flow, or it's kind of like the ocean waves. There's time to pull back, get new vision and perspective, and there's time to come forward with new momentum and execution. What was really fascinating to see behind the scenes, because it was about a year where he wasn't feeling fully his normal self of executing on a high level. But in the meantime, he met kind of like the girl of his dreams, and he walked through all those processes, and we worked through all the fears and anxieties. And he got to establish a really solid foundation there. He did a lot of personal development stuff. And then the really cool thing to see, even from a business standpoint, is when COVID hit, he was actually able within a weekend to transition his manufacturing business to create all of these, at the time, all these masks for hospitals, et cetera, and completely pivoted his business. And he was ready within a weekend to get everything set up, to get it all the processes he had to go through. And even just in business terms, he did in 1 month, 10 times what he was set to do in the year. And so it was really interesting to just see. I knew from behind the scenes, he had been in that catapult and really expanding his internal capacity so that when the moment was right, he was ready. He had the internal infrastructure to actually bear the weight of that next level of impact.
Wow. That's a great story. 10 times a year's income or growth in 1 month.
1 month, what he was trying, 10 times what they were set to do for the year.
That's crazy. But then I suppose, like you said, if you're not in a position where you're able to actually observe that shift and then take the
Right.
actions to put yourself into a position where you can take advantage of an opportunity like COVID, which was a huge opportunity to many, and not to others. But like then you're not really going to see those kinds of gains, which is why coaching and therapy of the likes that you offer is so undervalued. And obviously we're not saying that you're the sole reason why that happened, but we're saying that there was something to it. I mean, you were guiding this person and they recognized the value and they recognized where they were. And the catapult thing makes a lot of sense to me. I feel like that's what happened to me. I feel like that's where I am. I'm on the opposite side of that that journey.
No, and that's so clear just from knowing you just a little bit, and the little bit of your story you told me when we connected before. It's so clear the things that really like took you out, that's the very foundation or like seedbed that has catapulted you even in more alignment with what's in you to bring to the world, which I think is so special.
That sounds good. I'm going to try and get as much free advice out of you on this episode as possible.
Okay. That's smart. Yeah.
Can't go anywhere. What do you think that we all have the overachiever mindset, or is it like they say it's a very small amount of people, percentage wise?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I couldn't say. There's such a variety in how people are wired, how nurture versus nature, all those things. But what I do want to speak to based on that, so this might kind of answer it in a roundabout way, but I want to say that a lot of people that I work with, high achievers, struggle with the same thing. And in explaining that, I think it will also show the flip side if that's not what people's struggle are or what their struggle is. So basically, I want to explain this by first talking about healthy parenting. So healthy parenting, you have a combination of high warmth and nurture and high structure and expectations. So if a kid's parents have tons of expectations on them, very structured environment, but no nurture, no warmth, it's not healthy for kids. Alternatively, if it's all nurture and warmth, but no structure, no expectations, it's also not healthy. We need the both and. This is also true in the business world, like in managing teams. Obviously, in business, you have high expectations, bottom lines, but if people don't feel supported or they're cared about, they eventually leave. All that being said, the reason that I bring this up, and this is one of the key concepts that I talk about a lot, is self-leadership, the way that we lead ourselves and our relationship with ourselves. Most people don't even recognize they have a relationship with themselves. And so that's a lot of times a massive thing that I work on with people, because if you're not aware of what's happening, you'll always react out of old patterns. That being said, what a lot of high achievers tend to struggle with is they have no problem with high expectations and high structure, but what they do have trouble with is that high warmth and self-compassion. And you need the both and. So it's often for high achievers when they start to get burnt out or be too hard on themselves or hit a ceiling, it's not typically about lowering the expectations. Sometimes that comes into play, but first it's turning the dial on beginning to increase that self-compassion and self-nurture. I'm just saying this because I have a visual somewhere on my Instagram. It's in my program as well, but there's some visual on there where it talks about what's your self-leadership style. And it talks about those different quadrants. Like if you have both the high warmth and high expectations, if you're in severe, that's when you have the high expectations and the low warmth. But the other side, which a lot of people also struggle with, or they vacillate between, is when you have the high nurture towards yourself, but the low expectations. And that's when we become overly indulgent and we can never get traction on our goals, etc.
Mm. In my experience with my upbringing, I struggled to reconcile the differences in the parenting strategies between my mother and my father. So my mother would be the nurture side,
Yeah.
and she was very much so. My father was, it was almost like they were canceling each other out, right? Not canceling each other out, but they were matching each other in terms of their intensity. And my father
Yeah.
was incredibly strict. So I feel like they just kind of maybe, I don't know if they ever discussed this, but they maybe just kind of subconsciously met each other in the middle. And
Yeah.
it ended up being, I ended up demonizing my father because I felt like love was always something warm and fuzzy.
Yeah.
But in reality now, when I look back on it, I think that that was exactly what he had to do. Maybe not to the degree that he did, because he was pretty much beaten up as a kid. So,
Sure.
you know, it was very intense. And they joke that Asian fathers are basically just like that. You know, they're just going to do it the old fashioned way.
Yeah.
But it's always been a challenge. And I've always had father issues until recently. I've really started to work on them by just building a relationship with him. And I think that, you know, just to kind of bring it back to the conversation, I feel like a lot of overachievers have had similar situations where they've felt like they needed to validate themselves because they didn't get that from one of the parents or both of the parents.
Right.
And I see it often. I see it happen over and over again. It's that kind of nothing is ever good enough mindset,
Right.
you know. I always need to be better. I always need to have more. Need to prove myself more.
Yes. And the thing is, that will get you so far. Like you can succeed and achieve a lot cracking the whip on yourself. But eventually you hit a ceiling where things either crash or you plateau, or one more crack on the back will not get you further. And so one of the concepts I talk a lot about is all of our strengths become a weakness without a healthy boundary to protect them.
Mhm.
So I think of it this way. a fire loose in a home is destructive. That doesn't mean that fire is bad. That same fire within the confines of the hearth produces a cozy atmosphere and brings warmth to the home. So often it's not that something is wrong with us, but it's where our strengths go out of line. So it's where do those strengths of high performance or achievement or going for things, where does that need to be kept into the fireplace so it doesn't run amok in our lives? That's a key thing I think that's really important to consider.
Yeah. And it's one of those situations that you might face when, let's say, in a personal situation, your partner cheats on you. So you build up this kind of like a hard shell toward them, and you kind of say to yourself, and it's almost like a subconscious thing too, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm not going to let myself get hurt again. So you're shifting yourself completely to the opposite side of the spectrum of like that emotion. And I've done this before where something's happened. Like you said, a fire is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a great thing. It's a great thing. But if you let it get out of control, it can take your house down. So I've struggled with that, but I realize how important it is to balance your strategy. You can't just go, I was very binary before. Like, you know, I would get feedback and then I would be like 1. I get feedback, I'd be 0, you know. Balance is the key. Do you have any tips or kind of like a cheat sheet or something for people who find themselves in situations where they're incredibly pressured to perform and they need to be that self leader, or however you mentioned it before? I'm asking for myself, really. I was going to say I'm asking for a friend, but it's really for me.
Yeah. No, I want to share. Well, I want to share one framework to me, which is the foundation for this, because none of this can shift without self-awareness. That to me is the foundation piece here. If we don't have awareness, we ensure that we will react out of old patterns. We will ensure it. So one of my favorite things to teach about is this really simple framework that comes from neurobiology. So this is something that I learned from being in the trauma field, and it's kind of housed in that field, but I think it's so helpful to every person. So once you see this, you can't unsee it. I'll explain it. But basically, it's called the window of tolerance. We all have a window, even though you can't see it. Usually I think of 2 lines, and when you're in between those lines, you're in your window. And when you're in your window, you're connected to the wisest, kindest part of who you are. You can see the forest from the trees. You're in tune with your emotions and logic and reason at the same time. When you're in your window, your prefrontal cortex is online, and that's a part of your brain that's not fully developed till around 26. This to me is fascinating because a lot of us make major life decisions before our brain is fully developed. So if you counter that to kids, for example, are very concrete and literal in their thinking. The example I often use is, let's say there's a dad who's verbally abusive to his son, and he says, "You good for nothing idiot, you'll never amount to anything." A little boy doesn't have a higher understanding or abstract thinking. He doesn't have the ability to go, "Oh, my dad's just having a bad day and he's taking it out on me," or "his father treated him poorly and he doesn't know better." Instead, a little kid will just absorb it like an emotional sponge, and it will get stored in their body memory and their emotional memory, but it's not connected to logic or reason or abstract thinking yet. So we all have those imprints, different insecurities, rejection wounds, things from our childhood or upbringing that gets imprinted. Then we go about our business and we become capable professional adults most of the time until something pokes one of those old emotional wounds. When that happens, we go out of our window, our higher brain shuts down, and then we're literally seeing the present situation from a younger wounded part of ourselves. So this is a really big deal, because if I'm walking down the street and someone threatening is behind me, I want my higher brain to shut down. It's not the time for me to pause and go, I wonder what happened to them in their childhood that's causing this. Like, it's the time for me to fight or flee if I'm truly in danger. But a lot of us aren't in that. We're in relational situations or work settings, and something gets triggered and our higher brain shuts down. So just real quickly, you can go out of your window in one of 2 directions. If you go out the top, you go into a state of hyperarousal. That's more anxiety type of sensations. That's feeling panicky, something called catastrophic thinking, which is when your thoughts fly from 0 to 100. It's a fight or flight response. If you go at the bottom, it's a hypo response, hyper arousal or hypo on the bottom. That is more numb, shutting down, not feeling anything. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out. It's a freeze response. Basically, if you can recognize you're not in your window, the number one goal is to get back in. There's a lot more to that, but I want to set the foundation for this, because once you begin to recognize your window and when you're in it or not, it serves as a really simple frame and a way to understand yourself and relational situations. Like if a relational dynamic goes wrong, typically one or more of you were not in your window. Conversely, if you're able to talk through with the same person something really challenging, but you get through it and get closer on the other side, you are both in your window. So I know this sounds like I went way outside of what you originally asked, but to me, this is a key foundation, because when you're in your window, that's when you can access your higher thinking. That's when you can access flow state, your optimal brain states. That's when you can be in really true high performance modes, versus a lot of people ride that line, or they go out into that anxious, hyper arousal place and they're just reacting. And that is where you have diminishing returns.
Yeah, I'm definitely hyper when it comes to that. I always struggle on a daily basis, actually, with just hyper thinking about all the possible scenarios that could happen, and it's draining. I mean, I can imagine it might also be draining to just not feel anything too, but it really does. Is it true that you can expend your adrenaline glands just by being over processing for a certain amount of time? Like, can you just burn them out completely?
Yes. So I'm not personally trained in the medical and the biological side, so I can't go in depth on that, but I know that that's true. I know there's a lot of research on that.
Yeah. And so that's probably one of the reasons why taking breaks whenever you can, if you're a high performer, is in your best interests.
Yeah. Actually, can I share a quick story about that? I think is just helpful for people. Um, Maybe you've heard this before, but have you heard of the story of the two woodcutters ever? Maybe it will ring a bell.
But go ahead.
I'll share a brief version, but basically there's two woodcutters that go into the woods and are going to have a tree chopping competition. And one is an elderly, more experienced man who's done this a lot, and the other is a really young, strong guy who's really sure that he's going to win. So they set to chopping away, are chopping away. And after an hour or so, the elderly man pauses, takes a break, sits down, and invites the younger guy to join him. He's like, no way, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to beat you. I'm going to keep chopping. I'm not going to take a break. I'm younger and I'm stronger. So he keeps chopping away. Basically, that cycle repeats itself several times throughout the day. And then at the very end, they compare who chopped the most trees. And surprisingly to the younger, stronger guy, the older man who kept taking breaks had chopped a significant more amount of trees. He's like, how is that even possible? I never ceased chopping trees and I'm stronger than you. What's your secret? How did you do that? Have you heard the punchline before? Do you know what he says?
No.
No. Okay. So no guesses how he was able to chop more trees?
Oh, well, I mean, it seems like his breaks were, directly responsible.
Yep, that's a part of it. But here's the key. It'll make a lot of sense when I say this. So basically, he says, every time I sat down to take a break, I was sharpening my axe.
Oh, right. Gotcha.
So basically, you can chop way more trees with a sharpened blade than nonstop chopping away with a dull blade. And yet that is what high performers often end up doing once they enter the space of diminishing returns is, I just got to respond to this email. I just got to do this thing. And one thing that I've seen that has been in the business world that I didn't have from the therapy world beforehand was this intense time is money mindset. Like, time is money, just got to use this. And it's like this kind of like hectic feeling, pressure of always making the most of time and optimizing everything. And you can way over optimize where it backfires. Basically, time isn't the way that we think it is. If you are in your window, if you are connected to an optimal state of your brain and have a fresh mind, you can do way more in a few minutes than that trying to do the same task totally burnt out, like where we're just staring at the screen for 2 hours, barely functioning.
Yeah. I find that it's the same thing when I even put the guitar down for a day and I pick it up like a day later and I play. It's like I'm able to play so much better. And then if I keep playing for hours, I get progressively worse.
That's a perfect example.
It's very true. And you wouldn't think it, right? But like you just explained it, it makes a lot of sense. All right, tell me about this program that you're about to launch. It's called the Waymaker Program. What's that about?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So basically, there's a few different things I do within Scaling Within. The main thing that I started out doing is the one-on-one work with CEOs and founders. And to me, it's basically like a hybrid between counseling and executive coaching. So I'm definitely a proponent of therapy, but therapists don't always understand like high performance or entrepreneurship. And then you can have a great business coach or executive coach, but they don't always understand the inner workings of what actually holds someone back. So really, it's a space where people can process through relational issues at home, drama with customers or employees, overcoming anxiety, things like that. All that being said, as I was doing that work, I would see again and again the same themes come up for people. So even though I'm working with different people, it's the same thing of it's lonely at the top or this or that. And so over time, I kept trying to think, well, how would I solve for these things? Because I get to hear all these different people's individual stories and processes, but they only get to hear their own. And there's also such a massive ability. So I'm backing up my words here. When I think about that scaling your mountain of impact, a lot of people stay at the base of the mountain. Not everyone makes the trek up. So often you have to look across peaks to find other people pioneering, other people going for it. So to me, this Waymaker program is an opportunity to look across peaks. Basically, it's a 12-week program for pioneering entrepreneurs. A Waymaker is an English term, Old English term, I believe, for someone who paves a path, who clears a way. So I talked about us being in a transition of eras, a time in history where things are shifting. When things are shifting, it's always the time for innovation. It's always the time for doing things in new ways. And our intellect is great at making sense of what we've already experienced, but it gets in the way of what we haven't encountered yet. So there's a lot of people during this time who are having inklings about something to bring into the world, but it's never quite been done that way. So when there's no roadmap for what you're doing, I want to have a space for these people to thrive internally, because those are the ones that I think are going to impact society. And when whatever your internal culture is flows down. So all that being said, the Waymaker program is a 12-week program for pioneering entrepreneurs or people that they might work in corporate and they're more like an entrepreneur, or they know that they have an idea and they're working on getting the courage or overcoming imposter syndrome to begin to do that. Basically, the program goes through specific key strategies in a curriculum weekly in a way that's really, it's perfect for people that are busy. It's set to give the most amount of change and transformation with the least amount of time over the 12 weeks. But basically, you get those weekly lessons. And then every 2 weeks, we have a group coaching session where we get to deep dive and you get to connect with the other people. And there's a private community and things like that. So I'm in the third round right now. I launched this during COVID last July, and I'm just about launching the spring cohort in April. So whenever this is being heard, there's probably still time to join it. But basically, that's what I'm working to release. And it's been amazing. It's been amazing to hear the transformation for people, how it's impacted their businesses and their personal lives, which is what I love, the holistic impact.
Yeah, it sounds really holistic. Everything you've talked about today is not traditional, business education, right? This is the new way of seeing high performance. It's a human way of seeing high performance, not a numbers way of seeing high performance.
Yes. And let me add, sorry to interrupt here, but that just made me think. One of the things that I think is so cool or fascinating to me, especially coming from a marriage and family therapy background and bringing that into the business world, is having a developmental perspective. So, for example, the way you parent a 2-year-old is different than an 8-year-old, is different than a 16-year-old. If you're tying your 2-year-old shoe for them, it's helpful. If you're tying your 8-year-old shoe for them or your 16-year-old shoe for them, it's the same action that used to be helpful, but now it's harmful. So this is true in our own growth as a leader or within a team, like a startup team. Tying the shoes or just doing whatever it takes to survive is one thing, but it's massive to recognize when you're at the next developmental transition, where what was right for one season of development will actually hinder you if you don't level up and go to the next level. So that to me is part of this. It's getting all of these frameworks that actually position someone to have the awareness to not keep getting stuck, but to keep leveling up, to keep scaling within so that they can scale their impact externally.
Wow. This sounds like an excellent program. Do you have a specific website or links to your social where people can actually get in touch with you?
Yeah, great question. So I don't know how you do this, but I'm sure we'll link the actual things. But
We'll
just
do
to
that.
tell you, on Instagram, it's scaling within is my handle on pretty much all social media platforms. And then the website, my website is scalingwithin.com/Waymaker Program. That has all the info, and it's linked on my social media as well.
Nice. I've learned a lot and I've had a really fascinating conversation. I think this is one of the conversations that's breaking from the norm because, you know, we do talk a lot about very relational, interpersonal relations,
Yeah.
partnerships and things like that. So talking about professional things, I do actually see the benefit of giving our audience a lot of insight into that. Everyone wants to be better at what they do. And what we've discussed today, I'm a big believer in it. I think it's a huge step in the right direction. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was so fun, and I love the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot.